Hello and welcome back to the Peony Patterns YouTube channel. My name is Ashley and I am the sew along host here at Peony Patterns. Today we are going to be sewing the Calliandra dress together. So the Calliandra dress is perfect for both special occasions and everyday wear. The bodice features a sweet gathered flounce that also acts as a pretty flutter sleeve, and the gathered circle skirt provides stunning twirl factor. If you haven't yet purchased your copy of the Calliandra pattern, I will pop a link to that in the description box below to go ahead and purchase your copy prior to sewing. We are now going to jump straight in and see the pattern pieces that I have cut and prepared for my Calliandra dress, then we'll begin sewing. Here are all of my pattern pieces cut and prepared for my Calliandra dress. Firstly, I have cut one center front bodice main piece, and that is cut on the fold, and I have cut that in my main fabric. Then I have cut two center back bodice main pieces here, and they are cut as a mirror image set, and they are also cut in my main fabric. Then I have cut two front bodice side panel main pieces. They are also cut as a mirror image set, and once again I have cut those in my main fabric. Then I have cut the two back bodice side panel main pieces. Once again they are cut as a mirror image set of each other, and I have cut both of those in my main fabric. Then I have cut one front bodice lining piece. That pattern piece is cut on the fold, and I have cut that in my lining fabric. Then you will also need two back bodice lining pieces. They are cut as a mirror image set of each other, and once again I have cut those in my lining fabric. I then have cut my two gathered flounce pieces. They are cut on the fold, and I have chosen to use my main fabric for those as well. I then have my skirt pieces cut down here. So I have one front skirt piece cut on the fold, making sure to use the front skirt cut line. Then I have one back skirt piece, which I have also cut on the fold, making sure to use the back skirt cut line. Then finally, I have my skirt placket cut up here. So that is all of my pattern pieces cut and prepared for my Calliandra dress, ready to now begin sewing. Now, before we begin the construction of our Calliandra dresses, we are firstly going to do a little bit of optional preparation. So as I mentioned, this step is optional, so you can skip it if you wish. However, if you would like to go ahead with this step, we are now going to be stabilizing our left back bodice lining piece on the wrong side of the fabric with a strip of interfacing to prepare it for our buttonholes at a later step. So I have already gone ahead and cut my strip of interfacing that is 1.5 inches in width, and I have cut it so that it will fit with 1/2 inch to spare along the bottom raw edge and along the center back raw edge as well. Now I'm going to press that in place. Once we have then pressed our fusible interfacing to the wrong side of our left back bodice lining piece, now we can pop that pattern piece aside. And we are now going to begin preparing our bodice. So taking our center bodice main pieces, so I have my front center bodice main piece as well as my two center bodice back pieces. We are going to be taking our two back bodice center pieces and flipping those over so that they are now right sides together with our front bodice center piece, and aligning those shoulder raw edges and pinning. Then we can head to the sewing machine to sew where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, we are then going to separate our two center back bodice pieces away from our center front, and we are going to open those shoulder seams up and now press them both flat. Once pressed, we can now pop our center bodice pieces aside. Now we are going to be taking one of our front bodice main and back bodice main side panels and placing those right sides together. It is very important at this stage to make sure that you do have one of your front bodice and your back bodice side panels, as these pattern pieces are so similar. So double check the notches that you would have transferred on from the pattern pieces. And once you have ensured that you do in fact have one front bodice and one back bodice side panel, then we are going to be taking those, placing those right sides together, aligning them at the shoulder raw edges and pinning. We are then going to repeat those exact same steps for our remaining side panel pieces. So once again, I have a front bodice and a back bodice side panel here. So we are going to be placing those right sides together and pinning them at the shoulder. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine where we will sew where we have pinned with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once we have finished sewing, we can then separate our front and back bodice side panels apart, opening that shoulder seam and pressing flat. Then repeat that for our second set. Once complete, you will now have a mirror image set of your front and back bodice side panels. Then we can pop those aside as well. Now we will prepare our bodice lining pieces. So I have my front bodice lining piece here, right sides up. We are then going to take our back bodice lining pieces and place those right sides together with our front bodice lining, aligning them at the shoulder raw edges, then pinning. Once pinned, we can now head to the sewing machine to sew along those shoulder raw edges where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, we can then separate our back bodice lining pieces away from our front bodice lining, then open up each of those shoulder seams and press those flat as well. Once pressed, we can then pop our bodice lining pieces aside as well. Now we are going to begin the construction of our gathered flounce pieces. Firstly, ensuring that the center point notches have been marked along the raw edges of the inner circle sections of both of the gathered flounce pieces. We are going to start by finishing the outer curved raw edge of both of our gathered flounce pieces using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, and ensuring to not trim off any fabric whilst doing so. So I have gone ahead firstly to make sure that I have the center point marked on the inner circle of both of my flounce pieces. Now I'm going to head to my overlocker to finish off the raw edge around the entire outer edge of both of my flounce pieces. Once you have then finished off the raw edge on both of your flounce pieces with either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, then the next step is optional but is definitely recommended. So to now assist in the hemming process of both of our gathered flounce pieces, we can actually head to the sewing machine to sew a long basting stitch using a 3/8 inch seam allowance from this now finished curved outer edge. And that will then help when doing the next step of pressing that hem in place towards the wrong side of the fabric. So as I mentioned, this step is optional, but because of this curved edge, it can make the hemming process a lot quicker and easier to do. So I'm going to go ahead now back to my sewing machine to sew a basting stitch 3/8 inch away from this now finished outer edge. Then we'll come back with the next steps. So I have just gone ahead with that optional step of sewing a basting stitch 3/8 inch away from that outer edge. Now we are going to press our hem in place towards the wrong side of each of our flounces. So we are going to be taking that outer finished edge, now folding that 3/8 inch towards the wrong side of the fabric and pressing in place. If the optional basting stitches was sewn in the previous step, then you will now use those as a guide when pressing up your hem. So I'm going to go ahead and press the hem up on both of my flounce pieces, then we'll come back with the next steps. Once you have then finished pressing that hem in place by 3/8 of an inch towards the wrong side of your fabric, you can pop a few pins in to hold that in place if you wish. Then we are going to head to the sewing machine to edge stitch both hems in place. Once you have then edge stitched your hem in place, then you can go ahead and remove the optional basting stitches if you had also added those. Then we are going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches along the raw edge of the inner circle of both of our flounce pieces. The first row of gathering stitches will be 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge. Then the second row will be 3/8 of an inch away from that first row. So I'm going to go ahead and sew both rows of gathering stitches on both of my gathered flounce pieces. Then we'll be back with the next steps. Once you have then sewn your 2 rows of gathering stitches in both flounce pieces, then we are going to bring back our center bodice main piece. Now we are going to be taking one of our flounce pieces and gathering that to be the same length as one of the raw side edges of the center bodice main, leaving 1/2 an inch ungathered at each end. So I'm going to go ahead now to gather both of my flounce pieces to be the same length as the raw long side edges. Once you have then finished gathering both of your flounces to be the same length as those raw side edges, now we are going to be working on one at a time and placing those right sides together now with our center main bodice pieces along those long raw side edges, starting by matching up the center point on our flounce with the shoulder seam of our bodice and pinning. Then taking the short raw edges of each end of our flounce, we are then going to align that with the bottom raw edge of our back and front bodice pieces and pin. Once we then have those 3 points pinned, we are then going to continue by distributing the gathers evenly between those areas and continue pinning our flounce to our center bodice main piece by aligning the raw edges of our flounce with the raw side edge of our center bodice, making sure once again that they are right sides together and that we leave 1/2 an inch at either end of our flounce ungathered. So I have gone ahead and just popped a pin in on either end at about the 1/2 an inch mark to ensure that I do not gather in those areas. Once you then have both of your flounce pieces pinned in place, we are now going to head to the sewing machine to baste both of those where we have pinned using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have then basted both of your flounce pieces in place, then we are going to take one of our side panel main sets and now pin that right sides together with our center bodice, now sandwiching those flounce pieces in between. Making sure that when you are doing this step that you are now matching up your back bodice side panel with your center back bodice and your front bodice side panel with your center front bodice. So just make sure that you have those in the correct position before proceeding with the next step. Once you have double checked that, then we are going to align the shoulder seams on both of our center bodice pieces as well as our side panels and pin those. And then continue by aligning those raw edges and pinning down both sides as well. Once you have then finished aligning those raw edges and have pinned your side panels to your center bodice pieces, making sure to sandwich that flounce in between, then we are going to repeat those exact same steps on the opposite side. So starting off by aligning the shoulder seams and pinning, and then continue pinning down both sides. Once we now have both side panels pinned in place, we are going to head to the sewing machine to sew where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you have then finished attaching your side panels, we are then going to trim both of these seam allowances that we have just created down to 1/4 inch. Alternatively, pinking shears can be also used at this step instead. Once you have then finished trimming down both of the seam allowances, you can then go ahead and remove any visible gathering stitches. Then we are going to press both of these seam allowances in towards our center bodice mains. Once pressed, we are now going to head to the sewing machine to top stitch that seam allowance in place to our center bodice on both sides using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have then top stitched, we are then going to go ahead and baste the bottom raw edges of our flounce pieces to the side panel sections of our bodices using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So we'll be doing this step on both our front bodice as well as our 2 back bodice pieces. So we'll be basting to now hold those flounce pieces towards the side panels using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you like at this stage as well, you can trim the excess fabric off each of your flounces to now create a straight line so that they are now aligned with the bottom raw edges of our bodices. So I'm going to go ahead and baste those flounces in place towards my side panels, and we'll also trim the excess off as well. Now we are going to be constructing our bodice by taking our bodice lining pieces that we prepared earlier and now placing those right sides together with our bodice with our flounces added. So now by placing these right sides together, we are also making sure that we are matching our front bodice lining up with our front bodice main and our back bodice lining with our back bodice main as well. Now we are also aligning the raw edges on the inside of our neckline and are going to begin by aligning those shoulder seams and pinning. Then we are going to continue by aligning and pinning them together around the neckline and down both center backs as well. Once we have then finished pinning around the neckline and down both center backs, now we are going to head to the sewing machine to sew where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, we are then going to clip the corners and also the neckline curve, making sure to not clip through any stitching when doing so. We are also going to trim the seam allowance down to a 1/4 inch, but alternatively, pinking shears can be used at this step instead. Once you have then trimmed that seam allowance, the next step is optional before proceeding, and that is to now understitch the seam allowance of the neckline to the bodice lining from one center back corner to the other, sewing as close to the corners as possible and using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So if you do decide to go ahead with this step, we'll be sewing from the right side of our bodice lining, making sure that that seam allowance is now facing towards your bodice lining to make sure that we are catching that underneath as we are sewing. Starting at one back bodice corner, sewing from as close to the corner as you can, and then understitching along that bodice lining using a 1/8 inch seam allowance all the way around until you reach the other center back. So I will go ahead and do that step now, then we'll come back to show you exactly how that will look if you do decide to go ahead with that. So if you have decided to go ahead with that step, this is now what that will look like. So as you can see, I have understitched now that seam allowance in place towards my lining fabric, and I have just began and ended that stitch as close to both corners on the back bodice pieces. Now to prepare our bodice for the next step, we are going to be taking our gathered flounces and carefully fold those into the shoulder section of the bodice and the arm's eye, ensuring that the gathered flounce is kept well away from the curve of the arm's eye, and we are going to pin that in place. So just moving our lining pieces out of the way, we are then going to take our gathered flounce and just fold it on top of itself to now be in the center of the shoulder area and pin in place. So that is now well out of the way of the arm's eye. We're going to continue just by pinning a few more sections to ensure that none of the flounce becomes caught up in the next seam. Then we are going to repeat those exact same steps for the opposite flounce as well. So move the lining out of the way and then fold that flounce back in on itself and pin in place. Now that both of our flounces are pinned out of the way, we are now going to bring our bodice lining back over top, right sides together. Once both of our flounces are now pinned out of the way, we are going to now bring our bodice lining back right sides together over the top of our bodice mains. Now on one side of the bodice, we are going to now pin these arm's eyes together, making sure, as I mentioned, that they are right sides together, and we are going to begin by aligning and pinning them at the shoulder seam first. Then just continue by aligning those raw edges and continue pinning down either side. That is now one of our arm's eyes pinned. We are now going to repeat that for the opposite side. So right sides together, align those raw edges and begin by aligning the shoulder seams and pinning from there first. Then continue pinning down both sides of the arm's eye. Now that we have both arm's eyes pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew where we have pinned. Once sewn, we can then go ahead and clip the arm's eye curve and also trim that seam allowance down to 1/4 inch, or alternatively you can go ahead and use a pair of pinking shears. Once both of those seam allowances have been clipped and trimmed, then we are going to turn our bodice out the right way through the shoulders to the front. The gathered flounces can be gently pulled to assist with turning the bodice right side out, and as we are pulling these out, we can also go ahead and remove those pins that we had holding our flounce in place. Once turned out the right way, we can also go ahead and gently push the corners out on both back bodice pieces. Then we are going to go ahead and press our bodice. Once pressed, we are then going to open our bodice out, so separate the two back bodices from the front and have it right sides facing up. We are then going to take one of our back bodice pieces and separate the lining away from the main. And then on the corresponding front bodice, we are going to do the same. So separate the bodice main and lining so that we are looking at the right sides of both fabrics. So this is my front bodice main and front bodice lining. Then I have my back bodice main and my back bodice lining. We are now going to take that back bodice, folding it over right sides together with the front bodice so that our front bodice main and our back bodice main are right sides together, and our front bodice lining and back bodice lining are right sides together. Starting by aligning that seam and pinning, and then continue by aligning those side raw edges and pinning those together. So that is now one of our side seams pinned. So we have our back bodice main and front bodice main pinned, and our back bodice lining and front bodice lining pinned right sides together. We are then going to repeat that on the opposite side. So once again, taking our back bodice and separating the main and lining apart. Then doing the exact same for our front bodice. Then taking our back bodice, flipping it over right sides together, aligning those seams and pinning. Then continue by aligning those raw edges and pinning as you go. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine to sew where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, we are now going to press all 4 of those seams open. Then you can go ahead and turn your bodice out the right way, and then the next step is optional. So if you would like to, we can now go ahead and baste our main and lining fabrics together along this bottom raw edge using a 1/4 inch basting stitch. As I mentioned, this step is optional, but if you would like to go ahead with it, we will simply be taking our bodice lining and aligning the bottom raw edge of that to the bottom raw edge of our main fabric, and using that 1/4 inch seam allowance, we will start at one of the center back seams and sew all the way until we reach the other center back seam on our other back bodice. I will go ahead and do that step now to show you what that will look like if you do decide to go ahead with it. If you have decided to go ahead with that step, this is now what that will look like. So I have simply just basted my lining and my main fabric together along that bottom raw edge. Now we are going to go ahead and create our buttonholes. Alternatively, if you would prefer to create the buttonholes once you have completed the dress, you can definitely do that. Or if you are adding snaps, you can do that once the dress is completed as well. For those of you who are going to be creating your buttonholes now, we are going to be creating these on our left back bodice piece. So we are going to be creating 1 to 3 vertical buttonholes on this left back bodice piece. The buttonholes should be placed evenly 3/8 of an inch away from the center back here. The top buttonhole should be placed so that the top of it is aligned with the point where the center back ceases, being a vertical line. The bottom buttonhole should then be placed 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 inches from this bottom raw edge of the back bodice. So I'm going to go ahead and mark my buttonholes now, and I will come back to show you how I have positioned those. So I've just used some pins to mark out my buttonhole placement marks. So I am making a size 8 length. So for mine, I am going to be adding 2 buttonholes. Depending on what size you are making, you may need less or more. So I'm going to be creating my buttonholes between these pins. The top buttonhole here that I have marked out will be aligned with the point where the center back ceases, being a vertical line, and then angles up here towards the shoulder. And my bottom buttonhole is 1 1/4 inches from this bottom raw edge. So I'm going to go ahead now to create both of my buttonholes, and then we'll be back to show you what that will look like once completed. Once you have then created your vertical buttonholes, now your bodice is complete. Now we are going to be constructing the placket for our skirt. So we are going to start by locating our back skirt piece, remembering that the back skirt piece is wider than the front skirt piece. So make sure that you are working on the right one. We are firstly going to take that and fold our skirt piece in half, aligning those side raw edges to now find the center back of our skirt. We are then going to press along that fold to create a crease. Then unfold the skirt. So along the center back of your back skirt piece, you will now have a crease to now show that center point. Now we are going to draw a line that is 3 inches in length down that center back crease. At the bottom of that line, we are then going to draw 2 additional lines that are 1/4 inch in length, and they will be drawn at a 45-degree angle from the bottom of that 3-inch line. This is then what that step will look like. So I have drawn a line directly down that center back crease that is 3 inches long. And then at the very bottom of that, I have drawn 2 additional lines that are 1/4 inch in length, and they are both at a 45-degree angle. Then we are going to take a pair of scissors and carefully cut down that line and then both diagonal lines as well. Now, introducing our placket piece, we are going to be aligning the right side of our placket to the wrong side of our skirt along that opening that we have just cut. It is also normal to have excess fabric on either end of your placket as well. So we are aligning the raw edge of that opening to the top raw edge of our placket, and we'll begin pinning that in place. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine to sew where we have pinned using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, we are then going to fold our placket up and away from our skirt, and then we are going to press that seam allowance up towards the placket. Then we are going to fold the top raw edge of our placket over towards the wrong side of the fabric by 3/4 inch and press. Now we are going to take that folded edge that we have just pressed and fold our placket over once more by 3/4 inch. The folded edge of the placket will now conceal the seam where we attached our placket to our skirt, and we are going to press that in place. Once pressed in place, you can then pop a few pins in. Then we are going to head to the sewing machine and edge stitch that placket in place using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Once edge stitched, we are then going to trim the excess fabric from each end of the placket. Then we are going to fold the back skirt in half at the placket, right sides together. So I have just folded my skirt in half, right sides together at the placket, and have also aligned the short raw ends of the top of my placket. We are then going to pop a pin in there to hold them in place. Now, starting at the left-hand bottom corner of the placket, where our top stitching is, we are going to sew a diagonal line up through both layers of the placket at a 45-degree angle, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. I have just gone ahead and used an erasable marker to draw a line in to show you exactly where we'll be sewing. So starting here at the left-hand bottom corner, where the top stitching is, we will start sewing up through both layers of our placket at a 45-degree angle up to the folded edge of the placket. I'm going to go ahead and do that step now, then we'll be back with the next steps. Once sewn, you can then go ahead and remove that pin. Now, when you're looking at your skirt from the right side of your fabric, this is now what your placket will look like so far. Now, working with our skirt facing right sides up towards us, we are going to take the left-hand side placket piece and fold it under towards the wrong side of the fabric, and we are going to pin that in place. We are now going to head to the sewing machine to baste the left-hand side placket in place to the wrong side of the fabric using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you have then basted that left side over towards the wrong side of the fabric, then you are looking at your completed placket. Now to construct the skirt, we are going to introduce our front skirt piece. Now placing our front skirt piece right sides together with our back skirt piece, we are going to be aligning the side raw edges and pinning those together. Now is also an ideal time to add in any care and size labels into these side seams. Once you have both of your side seams pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine to sew along both of those using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then we are also going to finish off both raw edges using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished sewing both of your side seams and have also finished off those raw edges, now we are going to hem our skirt. Now the skirt can be hemmed either the traditional way or using bias tape. For the purposes of the tutorial, I will be showing how to do a traditional hem. So we are now going to head over to our overlocker or sewing machine to use a zigzag stitch along the entire bottom raw edge of our circle skirt, making sure to not cut off any fabric whilst doing so. So I have just used my overlocker to now finish off those raw edges along the entire bottom edge of my skirt. Now the next step is optional, but is definitely recommended to make the hemming process of this circle skirt a lot easier and quicker. And that is to sew a basting stitch around the entire bottom edge of your skirt now using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We will then go on to use this stitch line as a guide shortly when then hemming our skirt. If you would prefer to not go ahead with that step, that's completely fine, and you can shortly just go ahead and press the bottom raw edge of your skirt over to create the hem, but this definitely does help with making that process a lot quicker. So I'm going to go ahead now and do that optional step. So I'm going to sew a basting stitch 3/8 inch above this bottom edge of my skirt now. So I have just gone ahead and sewn that basting stitch now in place along the bottom edge of my skirt. Now to create our hem, we are going to fold now the bottom finished edge of our skirt over towards the wrong side of our fabric by 3/8 inch, and we are going to press that in place the entire way around. If you did go ahead with that optional step of adding that basting stitch in place, you will now simply use that stitch line as a guide when pressing up. Once you have now pressed that hem up in place towards the wrong side of your fabric by 3/8 inch the whole entire way around your skirt, you can pop a few pins in if you wish. Then we are going to head to the sewing machine to now edge stitch that hem in place. Once you have then finished edge stitching your hem in place, you can then go ahead and remove those basting stitches if you had added those earlier. Now to complete our Calliandra dresses, we are going to be gathering and attaching our skirts to our completed bodices. So to now go ahead and gather our skirts, we are going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches around the entire top raw edge of our skirts, starting at one side of the placket and sewing all the way around until we reach the other side, but making sure to not sew any of these gathering stitches on our placket at all. So the first row of gathering stitches will be a 1/4 inch away from this top raw edge of our skirt. Then the second row will be 3/8 inch away from that first row of stitching. I will go ahead now to sew my 2 rows of gathering stitches, then we'll be back with the next steps. Once we have then sewn our 2 rows of gathering stitches along that top raw edge of our skirt, we are now going to gather our skirts to be the exact same width as our bodice. Once you have then finished gathering your skirt to be the same width as your bodice, we are then going to turn our skirt out the wrong way and then place our bodice inside of our skirt, right sides together, making sure to match the front bodice up with the front of our skirt and the two back bodices up with the back skirt. Now I like to start by firstly aligning the side seams on my bodice with the side seams on my skirt. Then pinning both ends of the placket in place to our back bodices. Making sure to align the top raw edge of our skirt to the bottom raw edge of our bodice at all times. And when we reach the back bodice where we are pinning the back skirt in place with the placket, we are just going to align the long folded edge of our placket to the center back seam on each back bodice piece. Once we have those areas pinned, we're then going to continue by distributing those gathers and continue pinning our skirt to our bodice. Once you have then finished distributing those gathers evenly and have pinned your skirt to your bodice, now we are going to head to the sewing machine to sew our skirt to our bodice where we have pinned using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then we are also going to finish off that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once we have then attached our skirt to our bodice and have also finished off that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, then we are going to turn our dress out the right way. And then we are going to press that seam allowance now up towards our bodice. Once you have then pressed that seam allowance up towards your bodice, we are now going to top stitch the bodice to our skirt, now holding that seam allowance up in place as well. So we are going to be top stitching along the bottom edge of our bodice here using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once we have then top stitched our skirt to our bodice, now we are going to attach our buttons. So now we are going to use the buttonholes that we have already created on our left back bodice piece as a guide to now mark out the corresponding button placement marks on our right back bodice piece. So I have just gone ahead and marked out my corresponding button placement mark using those buttonholes as a guide. Now, keeping in mind that Calliandra is designed to have a 3/4 of an inch button placket overlap, I am now going to go ahead and attach my buttons to my right back bodice piece. Once you have then gone ahead and attached your buttons to your right back bodice piece, now you are looking at your completed Calliandra dress. Congratulations on now completing your beautiful Calliandra dress. If you would like to join in on one of our sew-alongs in real time, you can join our Sew Along with Peony Patterns group on Facebook, where we actually host these sew-alongs in real time, and there are also amazing prizes to be won. You can also join our main Peony Patterns sewing group on Facebook as well, where you can then share any of your makes and ask any questions that you may have. I will pop a link to both of those groups in the description box below, and also please make sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for all future sew along videos like today's. So a huge thank you to you all for joining in and sewing along with me today, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon for another sew along.